We're joined now by the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Mike Waltz, and it's good to have you here in person.
Thank you, Margaret.
So, Ambassador, on Friday, the president tweeted, "The Hormuz Strait will have to be guarded and policed as necessary by other nations who use it. The United States does not." And then last night, he threatened that if Iran doesn't fully open the Strait of Hormuz within 48 hours, the U.S. will hit and obliterate their power plants, starting with the biggest one first. So which is it? Is the U.S. opening Hormuz by force or having others do it?
Well, I think it can be both. It's not necessarily mutually exclusive. I'm glad you're having NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte on. I think at his urging and his leadership, we've now seen Italy, Germany, France, and a number of others commit to help with this effort.
After
particularly
since
so much energy is going to Europe out of the Straits. We just had the Japanese Prime Minister commit to portions of her Navy and the Japanese Navy. 80% of what's coming out of the Gulf is going to Asia. So we are seeing our allies come around, as they should. But at the same time, the president is not going to stand for this regime, as it's threatened and tried for 5 decades to hold the world's energy supplies hostage under its genocidal intent.
So some allies, like the United Kingdom, have talked about things like surveillance, anti-mining, anti-drone support for the United States, but in that appeal from the United States, I should say, in the Strait of Hormuz, but not until active combat ends. To be clear, that's what we're talking about.
Well, and the president's been clear, too. He's going to continue to pound Iran's capabilities, its missile, its naval, and its drone capability. Margaret, we have to take a step back. We've seen what it's doing now in terms of attacking ports, airports, civilian infrastructure, hotels, resorts, and what it's trying to do to global energy supplies. One can only imagine if it had a nuclear umbrella. One could only imagine if Iran achieved its aim to test, then you have Saudi Arabia wanting a nuclear program, perhaps the UAE, Turkey, or others. And when people ask, why does this matter to our security here at home, it should petrify every American that you could potentially have a nuclear Middle East awash in weapons.
Well, they're not enriching. They weren't enriching leading up to this. This is what U.S. officials have testified to. But just on this point about what the president
they couldn't enrich because of Operation Midnight Hammer that obliterated their ability to enrich. They had every intent to continue.
They do have a nuclear power plant, Bushehr. It's actually their largest energy plant. It's a civilian site. So
it's actually not their largest energy plant. It's about 1 gigawatt. They have larger ones that are gas fired outside of Tehran.
Okay,
but just case in point.
Okay, but in this case, in that clarification, the reason I'm asking you is when the president says he's going to bomb energy infrastructure, civilian energy infrastructure, is he going to bomb a nuclear power plant, or is that off the table?
Well, I would never take anything off the table for the president, certainly not on national television. However, there are larger plants. There's one outside of Tehran. There are others outside of other cities that are gas-fired, thermal powered. I think the important point here is to understand the IRGC, a declared terrorist organization, not only by us, but a number of European countries, controls a huge swath of Iran's critical infrastructure, their economy, and certainly many of their governing institutions. And so to the extent we're degrading their military capability and their defense industrial base, all options should be on the table, and the president's made that very clear.
How do you ensure that this doesn't constitute a war crime, which the UN Secretary General said an attack on energy infrastructure could be? How do you make sure this is not mass punishment for innocent civilians?
Well, I think, I would encourage and will encourage the Secretary General to point out the 20 to 30,000 Iranians that the regime massacred at scale, the civilian infrastructure that they're attacking.
But how do you make sure this doesn't
when you have a regime that has its grips in so much critical infrastructure that's using it to further not only the repression of its own people, to attack its neighbors, and in contravention of UN sanctions to march towards a nuclear weapon, then that makes those legitimate targets.
Okay. Well, you know that in many of these places, water desalination is linked into that energy infrastructure, civilian infrastructure. This is why it's a question of.
I have no doubt that the president, the Pentagon, their team will ensure that what they target is geared towards the military infrastructure of Iran. But I have to tell you, they deliberately blend, have a long history, everything from hiding weapons under schools and hospitals to using power plants and other critical infrastructure to not only power their military, but their civilian, and they deliberately blend in contravention of international law.
Let me ask you about what we saw overnight with these missile attacks. The director of national intelligence testified last week to Congress that Iran could not develop a militarily viable ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile, before 2035 if it attempted to pursue that capability. Yesterday, the IDF said that Iran did fire an ICBM. Has this changed the U.S. assessment?
Well, I'm not familiar with the IDF's assessment. I can tell you.
They said what was fired at Diego
I can tell
Garcia
you the UK just
ICBM.
condemned the firing of an intermediate range ballistic missile at Diego Garcia. That same type of missile Iran has lied about in terms of its development and said they were not developing, yet they just lied. Yet they just did it. Not only could it hit Diego Garcia, it could hit capitals in Europe. And Margaret, the technology, the booster technology that Iran has been hiding behind its space program, I don't think we're going to see Iranian astronauts on the moon anytime soon. That this space program has been hiding that technology. You have the reentry technology. To marry the two really doesn't take very much. In terms of technological development. And we just have to, thank God the president is taking action now and stopping this march towards a fully fledged nuclear program instead of waiting until after it's developed, like we saw in North Korea under the Clinton administration, say, surprise, we now have a full program. So
a difference there in the assessments. But let me ask you about our polling.
It wouldn't be the first time you have different intelligence assessments, by the way, by different intelligence communities.
Absolutely. The administration hasn't convinced, we've seen it in our polling, the majority of Americans that this war was necessary. 66% of Americans believe conflict with Iran's a war of choice. 60% disapprove of the U.S. taking military action against Iran. 57% of Americans think the conflict is going very or somewhat badly. How do you tell the American people they're wrong?
Well, I could quote a whole slew of polls that show, for example, self-described MAGA Republicans give the president a 100% approval rating. A majority say the number one job of the commander-in-chief is to keep Americans safe. I can point here to an NBC poll. 90% of Republicans, broader Republicans, support Trump's effort to destroy Iran's nuclear capabilities. And I have to point out, no one should be surprised here. President Trump has said Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. 2016 campaign, 2020 campaign. Since 2024, he's said it 74 times out in the public space.
But if he is going to commit any kind of ground troops or boots on the ground, don't you think he needs to persuade the majority of American people, not just his base?
I think the president will keep all options on the table to secure these objectives. And as a veteran, as a parent, I thank God he's not kicking the can like so many administrations have for 50 years until this is a catastrophic problem where we have very limited options to deal with, much less an entire Middle East potentially awash in nukes.
Ambassador Waltz, thank you for your time this morning.
All right, thank you.